Friends, welcome to another video lecture for Greek exegesis of Revelation. The title of this revelation is The Interludes in Revelation 6 through 16. In this lecture, I hope to provide a brief map or a mapping of the interludes in Revelation 6 through 16, which can be found in Revelation 7, 1 through 17, Revelation 10, 1 through 11:24, and in Revelation 16, 13 through 16. Then, having an idea of these interludes, I want to consider the role of interludes in ancient communication and its relationship to the book of Revelation. And then I want to conclude with the overall function of the interludes in Revelation. So to begin with mapping the interludes, the place to start is just to recall the cycles of 7 that we see in Revelation 6 through 16. So we see the 7 seals that begin in 6:1 and goes through 6:17, and then finally the story ends in 8:1. The 7 trumpets in 8:6 through 9:21, and then again it completes in 11:15 through 19. And then there are the 7 bowls of God's wrath in 16:1 through 12, and that sequence concludes in 16 verses 17 through 21. And so the general idea here, by starting with these 3 cycles of 7, is that there are these gaps or these interruptions in the sequence. The author has gone to great lengths to name 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then something else happens, almost as if it's off script or off camera. And many scholars would refer to these as interludes or digression. I want to talk briefly about each of the 3 interludes. The first interlude, as I've already indicated, occurs in Revelation chapter 7. And a brief outline of this interlude includes verses 1 through 3, where we see the angels and they're commanded to sort of withhold the winds, the destructive winds from the 4 corners of the earth. Then in verses 4 through 8, we see this description of the 144,000 who are called from the 12 tribes of Israel. And then in 7, 9 through 17, we see this picture of a great multitude, including their identity and their purpose, which is elaborated on in verses 13 through 17. And so the event right before this, I think it might be important for us to keep in mind the events that happen right before. The event right before this is the opening of the 6th seal, and it ends with the question, who can stand or who will stand at the day of the Lord? That seems to be an active question, and we might wonder if this interlude is an attempt to answer it or qualify it or even interpret that question. The second interlude occurs in Revelation chapter 10 and 11. It's basically the sum of those 2 chapters. It's a much longer interlude than the first interlude. And so in chapter 10 verses 1 through 10, we see an angel and a little scroll and the seer. And there's a lot more that could be said about that, but that's the general idea of verses 1 through 10. Then in chapter 11 verses 1 through 3, we have almost another gesture, another pivot of the camera to a measuring of the temple. And then again, almost as suddenly, we see a new item introduced in 11 verses 4 through 14, which is this elusive description of 2 witnesses. We get a description of their authority and their work, eventually their demise and the world's celebration, and then finally their resurrection and ascension. Once again, the event that is in the foreground, the thing that happens right before this, is the sounding of the 6th trumpet. And there is a note about humanity's refusal to repent, their unwillingness to repent and turn to God. And so then we see this event with the angel, and we see these 2 witnesses in chapter 11. Finally, the third interlude in this section of Revelation is Revelation 16 verses 13 through 16. And let me say at the outset that this is the one that there is probably the most uncertainty about whether or not it's an interlude or if it's just details that are added after the 6th sign. We can outline these short verses by talking about the arrival of the foul spirits that are associated with the sort of anti-God forces. We see the identification and the purpose of the spirits in verse 14. In verse 15, there's maybe a textual variant or a sort of aside in the narrative. And then in verse 16, it says that these spirits, these foul spirits, are those that sort of coalesce or gather together, the kings of the earth, to make war. And so the event right before this is the pouring out of the sixth bowl. And this results in the Euphrates River being dried up. And it's this drying up, really, that provides the kings of the earth, who are sort of being led by these foul spirits, to move across the earth and to do their conquering, destructive work. So if we think through these interludes together, and we think through comparisons and contrasts, the first thing to notice, obviously, is that they occur right before the seventh in the sequence of seven. They are in between the sixth and the seventh. And remember that in the cycles of seven, it's usually the sixth where things get really, really bad. And it's in the seventh where judgment is rendered, and maybe there's quiet, or it's the beckoning of the day of the Lord, the day of God's judgment. We also see similar introductions in all three of these interludes, with the verb adon, as well as kai in verse 10:1 and in 16:13. So John's visual attention is shifted with these interludes, and I think that's an important thing. A few other notes: we can pay attention to the presence of angels in the interlude in 7 and 10, interest in the temple again in 7 and 10, and interest in the beast in chapter 10 and chapter 16. With this mapping of the interludes and a little bit of each of them in mind, I want to talk about the role of interludes in ancient communication. And here I'm drawing on a book by Peter S. Perry called The Rhetoric of Digressions, Revelation 7:1 through 17, and 10:1 through 11:13, and ancient communication. And one of the things that Perry points out in this book is that in ancient communication, hearing was shaped by established patterns of communication, and that digressions and interludes would have been part of this pattern. And so although he's going to turn his attention to the ancient rhetorical handbooks, I think he starts with the recognition that people hear in a certain way. They're trained to hear in a certain way. And so whether or not the author of Revelation is schooled in the art and science of digressions or interludes, it doesn't matter. What matters is that the audience would be used to this. They would know how to respond to these interludes. And so when he turns his attention to the role of digressions, or the discussion of digressions in ancient rhetoric, he notes that some rhetoricians think that digressions provide some of the most memorable moments in narrative or in a rhetorical speech. Oftentimes, these interludes provide space for the author and the audience to deal with special topics, special considerations, and there's frequently an appeal to the emotions. Another thing that Perry points out is that there's actually a biblical precedent for what we see in the book of Revelation. There is an Old Testament Hebrew Bible precedent, and that is the 10 plagues in the book of Exodus. If you go back and look at the 10 plagues, you'll see there are 9 plagues told in pretty consistent sequential order. And then there is an interlude. There is a delay. And what is it? It's the Passover. It's the whole story of the Passover that protects the people of Israel and their firstborn sons from the angel of death. And so it's interesting that just as the seals might be protecting people in Revelation, so we see this idea of protection. So there's 9 plagues, the Passover interlude, and then the final plague that ultimately leads to the Israelites' freedom from Egypt. And so one of the things then that Perry says when he turns to these interludes in Revelation 7 and in chapters 10 and 11 is that for chapter 7, the function, or one of the functions of the interlude, is to give the audience confidence in the face of God's judgment. You'll remember that the unfolding or the unlocking of the seals is the first in the cycle of 7. And it is terrible, and it's terrifying. And so part of the response, part of the interlude is is a reminder that the audience can be confident in their safety, that the audience can be confident in their ability to stand, because they have aligned themselves with the way of God and the way of the Lamb. And then in chapter 10, Perry suggests a perhaps different function. Here, the function is to move them from maybe a place of inactivity to active engagement just like those two witnesses who unfortunately lost their lives, but were faithful witnesses and therefore models for the sort of active, faithful witness that the author hopes the audience will display. Building now on the perspective of Perry, I want to conclude with the discussion of the functions of the interludes. What is their purpose? What is their function? I think at one level we could just say that they do increase anticipation. I think of drama, TV drama, movie dramas, that right before the moment of crisis or the moment of climax, the attention of the camera moves to a different scene. So you're sort of left with a cliffhanger. You're left wondering what's going to happen. And so the interludes in Revelation might provide that sort of narrative pause. I also think, as Perry suggested, that they do offer an appeal to the emotions, moving from fear to confidence or from apathy to action. And then I think finally one of the functions, and this again I think through the TV media, of it offers a sort of, it pans over to another perspective in the narrative. It offers a different perspective, both in terms of time and orientation. And so in all of these, it's really hard to know sort of chronologically when they're occurring. Are they far off in the future? Are they simultaneous to what John and his audience are experiencing? It's unclear, but it's possible that Revelation 7 is imagining some future reality in a heavenly realm. Maybe then we could say that Revelation 10 through 11 is more attentive or attuned to earthly realities and human witnesses in the present moment. So maybe, even though it occurs afterwards, maybe Revelation 10 through 11 is actually more attuned to the present moment. And then Revelation 16, if we take those few verses as an interlude, we again see the earthly perspective. And here, the camera, it's almost to a back office or a seedy business deal. The camera zooms in on the rulers of the world and shows how they've been corrupted and how they've been compromised by the devilish and foul spirits. Well, I feel like this lecture is more speculative, more open-ended than some of my previous lectures. I hope, though, that it provides some generative conversations and generative thoughts about the function and the nature of the interludes in Revelation. I also hope that it models at least some of the exegetical process of moving carefully through a text, of focusing in on some particular questions, even if it's just a matter of bringing new light to these texts. Thank you so much for your attention, and I'll look forward to seeing you in our next video lecture.